This is called the Universal Periodic Review, UPR, and this year it is Iran's turn to be reviewed. The UPR focuses on human rights development in the country since the last review. So the question is, what has happened in Iran over the past 4 years? This is what the UPR will examine. Well, the truth is that the situation of human rights in Iran has deteriorated even further and is getting worse day by day. Some circles were hoping that the regime would moderate itself after the nuclear deal, but evidence has proven that this was an illusion. Since then, further suppression and executions of human rights activists and dissidents in all layers of society have taken place. Let's concentrate on some of the most recent cases. Since January 2018, when, as you know, major uprisings in more than 160 cities all over the country erupted, the regime has arrested nearly 7,000 dissidents, according to a report by Amnesty International. Most of those arrested were protesting against the harsh living conditions in Iran, the lack of salaries, of food, environmental damage done by the regime's policies. All that in combination with state authority investments. These were the reasons of the protest, and this protest was suppressed by the regime with extreme cruelty. To quiet the protest, the Iranian authorities have threatened the population with further suppression and executions. Over the past 3 months, about 1 execution per day has taken place on average. 100 days, 100 executions. Hardly a day without an execution or torture or other inhumane treatment of prisoners. During August this year, there was a sharp increase in the rate of prisoners' executions, arrests, and cruel sentences of activists. Iran's Human Rights Monitor issued a scathing report of human rights abuses with names of individuals who were sentenced to long prison terms and lashes for advocacy for labor rights or freedom of expression. Group execution of prisoners have been reported also in August. For instance, 8 prisoners were executed collectively in Gohazad prison in Karaj. This is reminding us too much of the disastrous events of 1988 that Christy and Laurent have referred to. 30,000 political prisoners were executed in 3 months, buried in mass graves, and they are still kept hidden by Iranian authorities. Because they do not even acknowledge that they have executed these people, instead they have promoted the people from the Death Commission, who ordered these extrajudiciary killings to positions as Minister of Justice, as Chief of the Judiciary. This is, how would I say, this is simply appalling. Of course, these promotions are clearly to guarantee impunity for the perpetrators of the massacre, and that greatly increases the risk of another wave of executions. Over the past 4 years, women's rights have deteriorated even further. Women's rights activists that protest for freedom of clothing are arrested and often sentenced to long prison times that include severe flogging. Any man on the street can stop a woman, harass her about their clothing and appearances. Therefore, women in Iran these days risk being sent to prison and flogged when they leave their homes to go to work, and that happens in all levels of society. There is jurisdiction that prevents women from participating in many normal activities of society. One very troubling example is the case of Sahar Hodayari, who sadly died due to self-immolation. She was protesting her prison sentence for trying to go to a sport stadium and watch her favorite football team. Iran is the only country in the world not allowing women to enter a sports stadium for watching a game. Inhuman sentences are also handed to labor activists, journalists, who protest or report on the financial mismanagement of the regime. Examples are 3 labor activists and 4 journalists that the Revolutionary Court sentenced on September 7th to between 6 and 18 years of prison and lashes. The journalists were each sentenced to 18 years in prison after being convicted. What was the reason of being convicted? Was, I quote, membership of a group with the purpose of disrupting national security, or, I quote again, spreading propaganda against the system, or spreading lies. What did they do? Well, they were working at an online magazine called GAM, which reports, as a journalist should do, on social justice issues, labor rights, any event that happens there that they consider to be of interest for the public. 18 years prison to be a journalist, to do their work. With this background, let me reiterate that human rights violation in Iran under the current regime is institutionalized and in law and in practice. It is a regime built on human rights violation. This is the foundation of the regime, to violate systematically human rights. I therefore want to emphasize to civil society, to states, especially to the European Union member states, as well as the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to use the existing mechanisms and do what they can to help changing the deteriorating human rights situation in Iran. The Human Rights Council mechanisms and the international community have a responsibility to stand with and defend the rights of those in Iran who simply exercise their rights to freedom of expression and freedom of association. Thus, the special rapporteur on the situation on human rights in Iran must press to getting access to political prisoners and prisoners of conscience. The Council must hold Iranian authorities accountable for their gross human rights violations. In particular, the special rapporteurs on Iran must press ahead to continue the work of late Mrs. Asma Jahangir, to shed light in the massacre of 1988. Undoubtedly, the international community and responsible nations have a whole range of issues to deal with when it comes to Iran. Those include, but are not limited to, recent provocation in the region, supporting terrorist groups across the Middle East, and the regime attempts to obtain a nuclear bomb. Irrespective of all of these issues and how the international community deals with them, the human rights work must remain in the core and the focus of our attention. Indeed, what makes other issues more relevant is the fact that a regime that does not hold human rights cannot be trusted in other fronts. To promote democratic values and human rights, the first step, the most fundamental and necessary step, appears to confront the culture of impunity that the rights abusers shield themselves in. Thank you.